The colony world called New Terra was home to 3 million people, who had left Earth behind to start fresh lives under alien stars. The planet sat in the perfect zone around its sun, where water could flow and crops could grow in massive dome structures that covered the landscape. Children laughed and played in parks while their parents worked to build something greater than themselves. For 15 years, the colony had thrived in peace and prosperity. Admiral Jacob Hayes had spent 30 years in the United Earth Space Navy, and most of those years had been quiet. He commanded the patrol vessel Valiant, which traveled the outer edges of human-controlled space, checking on trade routes and making sure colonists stayed safe. At 52 years old, his gray hair and tired eyes showed the long decades he had given to service. On this particular day, he sat in his command chair reviewing boring reports about ship movements and cargo manifests. Lieutenant Kelly Morgan worked at the communications station, and her hands moved quickly across the controls. She suddenly went very still and her face turned white as paper. The young officer turned to look at Jacob with eyes full of terror. She told him that New Terra was sending out emergency signals and the colony was screaming for help because unknown ships were attacking them without warning. Jacob felt his heart stop beating for just a moment. He pulled up the visual feed from New Terra and watched in complete horror as dozens of strange alien vessels surrounded his colony. Their weapons fired brilliant beams of energy that tore through the defensive platforms like they were made of tissue paper. The colony shields that should have protected the cities flickered once and then died completely. Buildings began to explode and burn while evacuation ships tried desperately to escape the slaughter. Kelly counted 60 enemy ships and possibly more jumping into the system every minute. The small defense fleet that protected New Terra fought back bravely, but they were badly outnumbered. For every human ship, there were 5 alien vessels firing weapons that seemed to ignore all known shield technology. Jacob watched helplessly as his people died in front of his eyes on the video feed. He ordered Kelly to contact Fleet Command immediately and told his crew to prepare the jump drive for maximum speed. His second-in-command, Commander Lisa Grant, reminded him quietly that they were 3 full days away even at the fastest possible speed. Both of them knew the terrible truth that by the time they arrived, there would be nothing left to save. Admiral Claire Bennett appeared on the screen from Fleet Command, and her face looked like it had aged 10 years in the last hour. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice stayed firm and cold. She ordered Jacob to stand down and not attempt a rescue because New Terra was already lost. Every available ship was needed for what would come next. The aliens had just made the worst mistake any species could make because they had given humanity a reason to unleash everything it had been secretly building. Jacob wanted to argue and fight and scream, but he knew she was right. He stared at his tactical display and watched the signals from New Terra wink out one by one like stars going dark. The bombardment continued for 18 hours without stopping. When the alien ships finally ceased firing and jumped away, there was nothing left but burning rubble and 3 million dead people who would never see another sunrise. The aliens called themselves the Krathian Dominion, and they were a warrior race that had conquered 6 other species in the last 300 years. They believed in overwhelming force and total destruction of anyone who opposed them. They had attacked New Terra without any warning or declaration of war. They had simply arrived and started killing everyone they could find. They showed no mercy to the children or the elderly or anyone else. Jacob stood on his bridge and felt rage building inside him like a nuclear fire. Lisa stood beside him, and both of them knew that everything was about to change. Humanity had always presented itself to the galaxy as peaceful explorers who wanted nothing but friendship and trade. The truth was very different, and the Krathians were about to learn exactly how different. In secret facilities scattered across human space, the real military had been building and preparing for 40 years. Deep inside hollow asteroids and hidden moons were shipyards that the galaxy knew nothing about. Automated factories had been producing warships by the thousands while pretending to be mining operations. Training centers disguised as research stations had been preparing crews for a war that everyone hoped would never come. The scale of the secret buildup was staggering beyond belief. Almost 500,000 military warships sat ready in hidden berths, waiting for the order to deploy. Each vessel was crewed and armed and supplied for extended combat operations. The weapons technology was decades ahead of what humanity had shown to other species. The shield systems were revolutionary. The targeting computers were precise enough to hit a single ship in a fleet of thousands. President Daniel Carter sat in his office on Earth and read the casualty reports from New Terra. 3 million names scrolled past his eyes, and each one represented a person with dreams and hopes and families. He thought about the children who had been playing in parks just yesterday. He thought about the parents who had worked so hard to build a future. All of them were gone now and turned to ash by an enemy that saw humanity as weak and helpless. Daniel picked up his phone and made the call that would change galactic history. He ordered the activation of the continuity protocol, which would bring every hidden warship out of storage. He authorized the mobilization of 500,000 vessels and 500,000 trained crew members. He gave the order that would unleash the largest military armada ever assembled in known space. The Krathian Dominion thought they had destroyed a defenseless colony. They thought humanity would beg for peace or surrender without a fight. They had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. In shipyards across dozens of star systems, the great vessels began to wake up and power their engines. Crews who had trained in secret for years finally learned the truth about their purpose. Admiral Jacob Hayes received new orders directly from Fleet Command. He was given command of the Third Fleet, which consisted of 50,000 warships. His new flagship was called the Retribution, and it was 10 times larger than any ship he had commanded before. He stood on the massive bridge and looked out at the fleet assembling around him in space. Lisa Grant stood beside him and asked quietly what came next. Jacob told her the truth without any emotion in his voice. The Krathians had killed 3 million humans, and now humanity was going to make sure they never killed another person ever again. The fleet was going directly to the Krathian home system. They were going to bring total war to the enemy doorstep and force unconditional surrender. The word spread across human space like wildfire. The secret fleet was no longer secret. 500,000 warships were gathering at assembly points in deep space. Humanity was going to war. President Daniel Carter walked into the United Earth Council chamber in Geneva, with his shoulders straight and his jaw set in determination. Every representative from every nation and colony on Earth sat waiting in complete silence. The massive room that usually echoed with debate and argument was quiet as a grave. Everyone knew why they had been summoned, and everyone knew that history was about to be made. Daniel gripped the podium with both hands and looked out at the assembled leaders. He began speaking in a voice that was calm but filled with barely controlled fury. 3 million people were dead and murdered without warning or reason. Men and women and children who wanted nothing except to build peaceful lives among the stars had been slaughtered like animals. The Krathian Dominion had shown humanity exactly what kind of species they were, and now humanity would show them the consequences. Ambassador Helen Price from the European Union stood up from her seat. She asked the president what he was proposing, because humanity had always maintained only defensive military forces. The known fleet consisted of barely 12,000 ships spread thin across dozens of star systems. She wanted to know how Earth could possibly respond to an enemy that commanded 80,000 warships and controlled 14 different worlds. Daniel looked at her and said that the 12,000 ships were only what humanity had revealed to the galaxy. What he was about to share was classified at the highest possible level and known only to a handful of people in the entire government. He nodded to General Marcus Webb, who commanded all human military forces. Marcus activated a holographic projector in the center of the chamber. The image showed massive construction facilities hidden inside asteroids and hollow moons. Shipyards the size of cities floated in deep space far from any traveled routes. Factories that had been disguised as mining operations for decades stretched across entire planetary rings. The scale was absolutely impossible to believe. Marcus explained to the shocked representatives that humanity had been preparing for this day for 40 years. Ever since the first contact with potentially hostile alien species, the government had been operating under something called the Continuity Protocol. Secret facilities had been built in hidden locations throughout human-controlled space. Automated manufacturing systems had been producing warships on an industrial scale. Resources had been stockpiled in quantities that would supply a major war. The hologram shifted to show rows of warships stretching into infinity. Hundreds of thousands of vessels in various stages of completion filled the hidden berths. Marcus told the council that 487,000 warships currently sat ready for immediate deployment. All of them were fully crewed by personnel who had trained in secret for years. Another 13,000 ships could be completed and launched within 2 weeks, bringing the total to exactly 500,000. Combat-ready vessels that the chamber exploded in voices as representatives shouted questions and demands. Ambassador Chen Zhou from the Asian Coalition stood with his face pale and asked how this was even possible. The cost alone must have bankrupted entire continents. He demanded to know why the elected governments had not been informed about this massive program. Daniel raised his hand for silence and explained that the program was designed to be completely invisible. Budget allocations had been hidden in normal government spending. The manufacturing was almost entirely automated, requiring minimal human oversight. The personnel believed they were training for deep space exploration and scientific missions. The whole point was to create a deterrent that enemies did not know existed. The Krathians had just activated that deterrent by attacking New Terra. Helen Price sat back down slowly, and her expression changed from shock to grim understanding. She said quietly that unleashing this armada would not be a defensive action. This would be total war on a scale the galaxy had never witnessed. She asked if the president truly understood what he was proposing. Daniel looked at her and said yes with absolute certainty. The Krathians had given humanity no choice in this matter. Intelligence reports suggested they were mobilizing for a full invasion of human space. They believed humans were weak and scattered and easy to conquer. Humanity was going to show them the truth and make sure they never threatened another innocent world. The vote was called and tallied. Every single representative voted in favor of war. The decision was unanimous across all nations and all political parties. Humanity would deploy its secret fleet and bring the full weight of 500,000 warships against the Krathian Dominion. In the days and weeks that followed, the secret shipyards came fully online. Crews who had spent years training in simulation were finally told the real purpose of their service. Weapons factories that had operated under civilian covers shifted to maximum production. Soldiers and officers who had believed they were preparing for exploration missions learned they were actually the tip of a military spear. Throughout human space, the great warships began moving toward assembly points in deep space. They traveled under radio silence using jump coordinates that had been prepared decades in advance. The gathering of forces happened so quickly and efficiently that it seemed almost magical. Within 3 weeks of the New Terra massacre, nearly 500,000 warships had reached their staging areas. Admiral Jacob Hayes received his orders and took command of the Third Fleet. 50,000 vessels would follow his orders and form one of 10 grand fleets in the Armada. His new flagship was the Retribution, and standing on its bridge made him feel small. The ship was massive beyond anything he had commanded before, with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand multiple nuclear strikes. Lisa Grant served as his second-in-command, and she walked the corridors of the Retribution with a sense of awe. Thousands of crew members worked at their stations preparing for the coming battle. Engineers checked every system 3 times. Weapons officers ran simulation after simulation. Medical bays prepared for casualties. Everyone knew what was coming and everyone was ready. The staging area, called Omega Point, was 3 light-years from the nearest star system. It had been chosen specifically because nothing was there except empty space. As the fleets arrived, that empty space became the most densely populated region in the known galaxy. 500,000 warships gathered in perfect formation, stretching across millions of kilometers. Captain Ryan Mitchell commanded a battlecruiser called Thunderstrike, and he was only 38 years old. He had spent 12 years training for this moment in secret academies. Now he stood on his bridge and watched the tactical display showing the incomprehensible scale of the assembled armada. His communications officer, Lieutenant Kevin Barnes, reported that 495,000 ships had reached the assembly point. Ryan asked his executive officer, Commander Amy Peterson, how many civilians knew about the fleet. Amy smiled slightly and said the secret was completely out now. News organizations were trying desperately to get footage, but the military cordon held firm. Social media across human space had gone absolutely crazy with speculation and fear and pride. Some people called it the greatest military achievement in history. Others were terrified that humanity was starting a war it could not win. Ryan looked at the display and said quietly that humanity was not starting this war. Humanity was finishing it and making sure nothing like New Terra ever happened again. Admiral Jacob Hayes called a meeting of all 10 fleet commanders. The holographic conference showed the faces of humanity's best military minds. These were men and women who had spent their entire careers preparing for a war they hoped would never come. Now that war was here, and they would lead 500,000 ships into battle. Jacob displayed a strategic map showing Krathian-controlled space. 14 star systems glowed red on the map, including their heavily defended homeworld. The Krathian military was estimated at 80,000 ships, with most concentrated around their core systems. They were a warrior culture that had conquered 6 species through overwhelming force and brutality. The commanders discussed 2 possible strategies. The first option was to systematically liberate every occupied system and free the conquered species. This would be slow and methodical, giving the Krathians time to prepare defenses. The second option was to take the entire armada directly to the Krathian homeworld and force immediate surrender by destroying their command structure. Admiral Victoria Kane commanded 50,000 ships in the 5th Fleet. She leaned forward and said that New Terra was not a military target, but a colony full of civilians. The Krathians had committed genocide without provocation. She voted to strike directly at their homeworld and show them what happened when you murdered 3 million humans. One by one, every commander agreed. The vote was unanimous again. 500,000 warships would jump directly to Krathian Prime and end the war in one massive, devastating battle. The assembly point in deep space looked like a city made of steel and light. 500,000 warships floated in perfect formation, waiting for the order to jump. Each vessel held a crew that had trained for years. Each captain knew their role in the coming battle. Each soldier understood that they were about to make history. Captain Ryan Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Thunderstrike and watched the final preparations. His crew moved with quiet efficiency, checking systems and running diagnostics. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes reported that all ships in Fleet Group 7 had confirmed ready status. Commander Amy Peterson reviewed the battle plan one more time, making sure every detail was perfect. Ryan looked at the tactical display showing the massive fleet. The armada was organized into 10 grand fleets with 50,000 ships each. Every grand fleet was divided into smaller groups designed for specific purposes. Heavy battleships would absorb enemy fire and deal devastating damage. Carrier groups would launch swarms of fighters. Fast cruisers would exploit weaknesses and chase down fleeing enemies. The ships came in many different classes and sizes. Massive dreadnoughts stretched over 2 kilometers long with enough firepower to level cities. Sleek destroyers barely 300 meters carried precision weapons. Carriers held thousands of fighters in their bellies. Support vessels carried supplies and ammunition and repair equipment. All of them together formed the most powerful military force ever assembled. Admiral Jacob Hayes gathered his senior staff in the war room of the Retribution. Holographic displays showed intelligence about the Krathian homeworld. The planet called Krathios Prime orbited a binary star system. Massive cities covered 3 continents. Orbital stations and defensive platforms ringed the world. Shipyards constantly produced new vessels for their conquest fleets. The Krathian military numbered around 80,000 ships according to the best estimates. Most of them were scattered across 14 occupied systems. Intelligence suggested maybe 15,000 vessels defended the homeworld itself. The Krathians had never faced an enemy with equivalent numbers. Their entire military strategy relied on overwhelming smaller forces through superior firepower. Lisa Grant pulled up analysis of the wreckage from New Terra. Human scientists had studied every piece of debris they could recover. The Krathian ships used thick armor instead of advanced shields. Their weapons were powerful but not particularly accurate. They relied on massed fire to destroy targets. Their tactics were straightforward and predictable. Admiral Victoria Kane joined the meeting from her flagship. She commanded the 5th Grand Fleet, and her reputation for aggressive tactics was legendary. She suggested that the human fleet should emerge from jump space in 3 waves. The first wave would draw enemy fire and engage their defensive platforms. The second wave would launch fighters and establish space superiority. The third wave would deliver the killing blow to their fleet. The other commanders agreed with the strategy. Admiral George Palmer would lead the first wave with the heaviest battleships. Admiral Jennifer Cole would command the carrier groups in the second wave. Victoria would bring her fast attack ships in the third wave to finish any survivors. Jacob looked at his fellow officers and felt the weight of command. 500,000 ships and crews trusted him to lead them into battle. 3 million dead civilians demanded justice. The future safety of humanity depended on what happened in the next few days. The final order came from President Daniel Carter himself. The message was brief and direct. The fleet was authorized to jump to Kratheos Prime and engage all military targets. Civilian casualties must be avoided whenever possible. The goal was to force unconditional surrender, not genocide. Humanity would show the galaxy that it could wage war with honor. Ryan Mitchell gathered his crew in the main briefing room. Hundreds of faces looked at him with expressions ranging from determination to fear. He told them they were about to do something that mattered. New Terra had burned and 3 million innocent people had died. The Krathians thought humanity was weak and easy to conquer. In a few hours they would learn the truth. Throughout the Armada, similar speeches took place. Captains spoke to their crews. Officers checked on their soldiers. Chaplains held services for those who wanted to pray. Medical staff prepared operating rooms. Engineers made final adjustments to weapons and engines. Everyone did their part. The countdown began at exactly midnight station time, 10 hours until jump. Crews ate their meals and tried to rest. Some wrote letters to families back home. Others simply sat quietly thinking about what was coming. The veterans who had seen combat before checked their gear methodically. The young recruits tried not to show their nervousness. At 6 hours until jump, Admiral Jacob Hayes addressed the entire fleet. His face appeared on every screen in every ship. He spoke about duty and honor and sacrifice. He reminded them why they were here and what they were fighting for. He promised them that New Terra would be avenged, and that no other human colony would suffer the same fate. At 3 hours until jump, the fleet began moving into final formation. The massive vessels shifted position with surprising grace. Navigation computers calculated jump coordinates with perfect precision. Power plants ramped up to maximum output. Weapon systems came online and targeting computers locked onto projected enemy positions. At 1 hour until jump, the order for battle stations echoed through every corridor. Crew members rushed to their posts. Bulkheads sealed. Armor plating extended over viewports. Shield generators hummed with building energy. The fleet transformed from a gathering of ships into a weapon of war. At 10 minutes until jump, complete silence fell across the Armada. 500,000 ships floated in the void waiting. Millions of hearts beat faster. Hands gripped controls. Eyes watched countdown timers. The moment stretched out, feeling like eternity. At precisely 0 hour, the jump drives activated simultaneously. 500,000 ships ripped holes in space and vanished in cascades of light. The flash could be seen from nearby star systems. Sensors recorded energy readings that broke every previous scale. Empty space filled with exotic particles as reality bent to human will. The journey through jump space took 4 weeks. The ships traveled faster than light through dimensions that human minds could barely comprehend. During the journey, there was nothing to do but wait and train and prepare. Simulations ran constantly. Strategies were refined. Backup plans were created. Captain Ryan Mitchell used the time to bond with his crew. He walked every deck of the Thunderstrike and learned names and faces. He visited the engine rooms and weapons bays. He sat with young soldiers and listened to their fears. He wanted them to know he cared about each of them. Admiral Jacob Hayes met daily with his commanders. They reviewed intelligence and adjusted the battle plan. New information arrived from spy satellites that had been secretly watching Kratheos Prime. The Krathians seemed completely unaware that 500,000 warships were coming for them. The final week of jump space felt longer than the first 3. Anticipation built to almost unbearable levels. Crew members triple-checked everything. Weapons were tested and retested. Fighters were fueled and armed. Marines inspected their combat gear. Medical supplies were inventoried. On the last day before arrival, Admiral Victoria Kane sent a message to her fleet. She told them to remember that they were not conquerors or murderers. They were defenders and liberators. The Krathians had chosen war through their actions. Humanity would end that war decisively but with honor. The countdown to system arrival began 12 hours before emergence. Final battle stations were called. All unnecessary systems were shut down to maximize power for weapons and shields. Crew members donned their combat suits. Officers reviewed their orders one last time. At 1 hour before arrival, the entire fleet went into complete communications silence. From this point forward, only emergency channels would be open. Each ship knew its role and its target. The coordination would happen through pre-programmed commands and computer synchronization. At 10 minutes before arrival, Admiral Jacob Hayes stood on the bridge of the Retribution and looked at his crew. These people had trained for years for this moment. They were ready. He was ready. Humanity was ready. At 0 hour, 500,000 human warships exploded back into normal space at the edge of the Kratheos system. Sensors immediately began scanning for targets. Weapons locked onto enemy positions. The greatest battle in galactic history was about to begin. The Krathian homeworld hung in space ahead of them, completely unaware that their civilization had mere hours left, before everything changed forever. High Commander Zarketh of the Krathian Dominion stood in the orbital command station above his homeworld. He had served the Empire for 50 years and conquered 4 worlds personally. Today he felt bored reviewing routine reports from occupation forces. The conquest of the human colony had been disappointingly easy. The pathetic creatures had barely fought back before their world burned. His sensor officer called out that multiple jump signatures were being detected at the system edge. Zarketh barely looked up from his reports. He assumed it was a merchant convoy or perhaps a small human patrol coming to beg for peace. He had been hoping the humans would send their actual military so he could enjoy crushing them. The sensor officer spoke again, and his voice cracked with something that sounded like fear. The computer was having trouble counting the incoming contacts. There were too many ships for the system to process quickly. The number kept climbing from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. Zarketh turned to look at the tactical display and felt ice water flood through his veins. The screen showed a solid wall of contacts stretching across millions of kilometers. The computer finally settled on a number that made no sense. 500,000 enemy vessels had just entered the system in perfect military formation. He whispered that it was impossible, because no species in the galaxy commanded that many warships. The entire Krathian fleet numbered only 80,000 ships. Even the ancient empire builders at the height of their power had never assembled such a force. This had to be a sensor malfunction or a computer error, but the sensors were functioning perfectly and the computers were not wrong. 500,000 human warships hung in space like an avalanche waiting to fall. Every single vessel showed active weapons and powered shields. This was not a merchant convoy. This was death itself come calling, Admiral. Jacob Hayes stood on the bridge of the Retribution as the human armada materialized around Kratheos Prime. The formation was absolutely perfect despite the complexity of jumping so many ships simultaneously. 10 grand fleets arranged themselves into 3 massive waves. The first wave consisted of heavy battleships and dreadnoughts designed to absorb punishment. The second wave held the carriers already launching swarms of fighters. The third wave contained fast attack cruisers ready to exploit any weakness. Jacob opened a channel to all ships and gave the order for battle stations. Weapon systems activated across 500,000 vessels, targeting computers locked onto Krathian orbital platforms and defensive installations. Fightercraft poured out of carriers like angry hornets. The display showed a battle formation that stretched farther than the eye could see. The Krathian defense fleet scrambled desperately to respond. 15,000 warships launched from orbital docks and planetary bases. Officers screamed orders. Crews rushed to battle stations. Alarms blared across every Krathian vessel. They formed a defensive line between the human fleet and their homeworld. 15,000 ships against 500,000. The Krathians were outnumbered more than 30 to 1. Captain Ryan Mitchell watched from the thunderstrike as the first wave advanced. Heavy battleships moved forward in a wall of steel. Their shields glowed with power. Their main guns charged to full capacity. Behind them came carrier groups launching fighters until space filled with thousands of small craft. The third wave held position waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jacob gave the order and the human fleet opened fire. 50,000 battleships in the first wave unleashed their weapons simultaneously. Beams of concentrated energy and streams of plasma crossed the void. Missiles launched by the millions. The combined firepower was beyond anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Krathian fleet fired back with everything they had. Their weapons were powerful and their aim was true. Several human ships took damage, and a few of the smaller vessels exploded in brilliant fireballs. Crew members died in those first moments, but for every human ship destroyed, the concentrated fire from hundreds of vessels obliterated Krathian warships completely. The battle raged with terrible intensity. Explosions lit up space like new stars being born. Ships on both sides maneuvered desperately. The Krathians fought with savage courage, but they were simply overwhelmed by numbers. Their defensive line began to crack under the relentless assault. Ryan gave orders to his crew, and the Thunderstrike's main cannons roared to life. Plasma bolts struck a Krathian heavy cruiser and tore through its armor. The enemy ship tried to return fire, but 3 other human vessels targeted it simultaneously. The cruiser exploded in a cascade of secondary detonations. Admiral Victoria Kane led the second wave into the fight. Carrier groups launched wave after wave of fighters. Thousands of small craft swarmed around Krathian ships like piranha. They targeted engines and weapon systems. They overwhelmed point defense systems through sheer numbers. Krathian ships that had survived the battleship assault found themselves under attack from all directions. The orbital defense platforms tried to provide supporting fire. These massive structures bristled with weapons and had defended Krathios Prime for a century. But human commanders had planned for this. Entire fleet groups concentrated fire on individual platforms. The structures could not withstand such focused assault. One by one, they exploded or went dark. Commander Amy Peterson coordinated the fighter wings from the Thunderstrike. She watched the tactical display and vectored squadrons to where they were needed most. Human pilots were well trained and their craft were fast. They danced through Krathian fire and struck with precision. Enemy ships burned under the combined assault. The battle continued for 6 brutal hours. The Krathians fought with desperate courage, knowing their homeworld hung in the balance. They threw everything they had into the defense. But courage could not overcome such overwhelming numerical superiority. Their ships were destroyed faster than they could regroup. Their defensive platforms fell one by one. Their orbital shipyards exploded in spectacular fireballs. Admiral George Palmer's battleships pushed forward relentlessly. They absorbed damage that would have destroyed smaller ships. Their thick armor and powerful shields kept them in the fight. Behind their protective wall, the carriers continued launching fighters. The Krathian fleet was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. High Commander Zarketh watched his fleet die. Every report brought worse news. The orbital platforms were destroyed. The shipyards were burning. His ships were being hunted down and killed. He had never imagined such a catastrophic defeat. The humans fought with a precision and coordination that seemed impossible for such a large force. He tried to rally his remaining ships for a final stand. Perhaps they could inflict enough damage to force a negotiated peace. But even as he gave the orders, he knew it was hopeless. The humans showed no sign of slowing. They pressed their advantage mercilessly. Admiral Victoria Kane saw the enemy attempting to regroup and immediately gave orders. Her fast attack cruisers swept in from the flanks. They moved with incredible speed, cutting off retreat routes and destroying communications relays. The Krathian formation collapsed completely under the coordinated assault. By the 10th hour of battle, the Krathian defense fleet was reduced to scattered survivors. The once mighty force that had terrorized 6 species and conquered 14 worlds was shattered. Orbital platforms that had guarded the homeworld for generations were nothing but debris. Shipyards that had built fleets were twisted metal cooling in the void. The human fleet held position with weapons still active. They had taken losses, but nothing compared to the devastation inflicted on the enemy. A few thousand human ships were damaged or destroyed. The Krathian defense force was effectively annihilated. Admiral Jacob Hayes opened a wideband transmission to the planet's surface. His voice carried to every receiver on Krathios Prime. He identified himself and told them exactly why 500,000 human warships now controlled their orbit. He spoke about New Terra and 3 million dead. He described how the Krathians had attacked without warning or provocation. He explained that humanity now had the power to do the same to them. Human weapons could reduce their cities to ash. Human ships could bombard their world until nothing lived. But then Jacob said something that shocked everyone listening. Humanity would not do that. Humans did not wage war on civilians. Humans were not like the Krathians. The orbital defenses were destroyed and the fleet was broken, but the cities would be spared. However, the terms were non-negotiable. The Krathian Dominion would withdraw from every conquered system immediately. They would pay reparations to every species they had enslaved. They would submit to oversight by a galactic council. Their military would be limited to defensive forces only. They would never again threaten another world. If they refused, then humanity would systematically dismantle their civilization piece by piece. Every military installation would be destroyed. Every government building would be reduced to rubble. The Krathian Dominion would cease to exist as anything more than a cautionary tale. The silence that followed stretched for 3 long hours. The Krathian High Council met in emergency session. They looked at the sensor readings showing 500,000 human ships in orbit. They reviewed the casualty reports. They understood that refusal meant extinction. The surrender came through official channels. The Krathian Dominion. 6 months after the Battle of Krathios Prime, the galaxy looked very different than it had before. Admiral Jacob Hayes stood in the observation deck of Unity Station, watching ships from a dozen species dock at the massive orbital facility. The station floated in neutral space halfway between human territory and the former Krathian Dominion. It served as headquarters for the new Galactic Peacekeeping Council. Commander Lisa Grant joined him at the viewport. She commented that 6 months ago humanity had been practically unknown. The galaxy had viewed humans as minor players barely worth noticing. Now humanity was the superpower that everyone either respected or feared. The change had happened so fast it still felt unreal. Jacob nodded slowly and said that fear was not what he wanted. Respect was better. Understanding that humanity would not tolerate genocide was the goal. The war had ended quickly after Krathios Prime surrendered, but the aftermath had been incredibly complex. 6 species that the Krathians had conquered were now free, but rebuilding would take decades. The Krathian Dominion itself had been reduced to a single-star system under strict monitoring. President Daniel Carter had addressed the United Nations 3 months earlier, announcing major changes to human military policy. Half of the Great Armada would be decommissioned and converted to civilian purposes. Warships became colony transports and research vessels. The other half would form the core of a new galactic defense, fleet open to volunteers from any species, willing to stand against aggression. Captain Ryan Mitchell had been reassigned from combat duty to training operations. His new job was helping integrate alien officers into the mixed species fleet units. It was challenging work because every species had different biology and culture. Teaching beings from different worlds to work together required patience and creativity. But Ryan found it more rewarding than he had ever expected. He sat in the officer lounge of Unity Station with Commander Amy Peterson drinking coffee. He told her what surprised him most was how many former Krathian subjects wanted to join the fleet. These were people who had spent centuries under brutal oppression. Now they were volunteering to defend others from suffering the same fate. It gave him hope for the future. The galaxy had learned several important lessons from humanity's sudden emergence as a military superpower. First, that hidden strength could be more dangerous than obvious power. Second, that a species motivated by justice for its dead would stop at nothing. Third, and most importantly, that humanity possessed something rare in the cosmos. Humans had the ability to show mercy even in the moment of total victory. Ambassador Helen Price served as humanity's chief representative to the Galactic Council. She attended a diplomatic dinner with representatives from the Vexian Commonwealth, which was one of the species freed from Krathian rule. The Vexian ambassador looked at her with curiosity and said that humans interested his people greatly. He explained that humanity had built an armada capable of conquering half the galaxy. The fleet could have swept across space, taking whatever it wanted. Yet humans used that power only to defend and liberate. They chose mercy when they could have chosen vengeance. He wanted to understand why. Helen smiled and explained that humanity remembered its own history. Earth had gone through centuries of war. Empires rose and fell. The strong crushed the weak over and over again. Eventually, humans learned that true strength was not measured by who you could defeat. True strength was measured by who you chose to protect. Back on Earth, massive memorials were being constructed for the victims of New Terra. 3 million names would be carved in black stone. Gardens and reflecting pools would surround the monument. President Daniel Carter attended the dedication ceremony, standing with survivors who had been off-world when the attack occurred. He spoke to the assembled crowd about memory and sacrifice. New Terra would burn forever in human consciousness as a reminder of the cost of complacency. The Armada had been built to avenge those deaths. 500,000 warships had been unleashed to ensure the massacre meant something. Now that fleet would be maintained not for conquest but to prevent any other species from suffering what New Terra suffered. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence that stretched across the entire planet. Then 3 million candles were lit, one for each soul lost. From orbit, the lights formed a pattern visible from space. The message was written in a dozen different languages, but the meaning was universal. Never again. Admiral Jacob Hayes retired from active duty 8 months after the war. He chose to spend his remaining years teaching at the Naval Academy on Mars. On his last day in uniform, he stood before a class of cadets, both human and alien. He gave them one final lesson that he hoped they would carry forever. He told them that humanity had shown the galaxy what it could do when pushed to the edge. The Armada had proven that humans could build an unstoppable force. The battle had demonstrated that human warriors could wage war on an unprecedented scale. But the real test of character was not in how they fought. The real test was in how they won. Jacob explained that humanity had possessed the power to burn. Krathian worlds like the Krathians burned New Terra. The fleet could have reduced their cities to ash and their people to memories. But humans chose mercy instead. That choice defined humanity more than any weapon ever could. The years that followed brought an era of peace unlike anything the galaxy had known. The Galactic Defense Fleet grew to include ships from 40 different species. They patrolled trade routes and mediated disputes before violence could erupt. Cultural exchange programs brought together species who had never met in peace. Trade flourished across former boundaries. Captain Ryan Mitchell eventually took command of a mixed-species cruiser called the Harmony. His crew included humans and Vexians and even a few reformed Krathians. They worked together protecting merchant convoys and responding to distress calls. It was exactly the kind of future that New Terra had been building toward. On Earth, in the archives of the United Nations, a classified document remained sealed behind multiple layers of security. The document contained complete schematics for the secret shipyards. It included plans for automated factories and training facilities. Everything needed to build another armada was preserved and protected. The document was labeled with a simple warning printed in red letters. In case of emergency break glass, humanity will rise again if needed. The systems and facilities still existed hidden throughout human space. The knowledge and capability remained ready to be activated. The galaxy had witnessed what happened when 3 million humans died. Every species understood the lesson. No one wanted to discover what would happen if Earth itself was threatened. The Krathians had learned that truth in fire and fury. The rest of the galaxy took note and adjusted their behavior accordingly. Humanity had unleashed 500,000 warships once for justice and protection. The Armada had struck with precision and overwhelming force, but it had also shown restraint and mercy. That combination of strength and compassion changed how every species viewed humans. The memorial on Earth became a place of pilgrimage. Beings from across the galaxy came to pay respects to the 3 million who had died. They read the names and walked among the gardens. They learned about the colony that had been destroyed and the response that had shaken civilization. Admiral Victoria Kane visited the memorial on the 5th anniversary of New Terra's fall. She stood before the wall of names and remembered the faces she had seen in intelligence reports. Children who would never grow up. Parents who would never see another sunrise. Elderly who had survived Earth's troubles only to die among the stars. She whispered a promise to those names. Humanity would never forget them. The fleet would always stand ready. No other world would burn while humans had the power to prevent it. The galaxy was safer because of their sacrifice and humanity's response. President Daniel Carter gave a speech that day broadcast across human space and beyond. He said that New Terra had paid the ultimate price to teach the galaxy a lesson. Peaceful species needed the strength to defend themselves. Aggressive species needed to understand there were consequences for their actions. The balance between these truths would define the future. He finished by saying that humanity hoped to never again unleash such devastating force. But the capability remained ready. The shipyard still existed. The training continued. The weapons stayed sharp. Peace was wonderful, but it could only be maintained through strength and vigilance. The sun set over the New Terra memorial painting, the sky in shades of orange and red. 3 million candles flickered in the growing darkness, and somewhere in deep space, hidden facilities held 500,000 warships ready to wake if needed. The galaxy had changed forever. Humanity had shown its true nature, strong enough to destroy, wise enough to show mercy, determined enough to never forget. The age of unchecked aggression was over. A new era of enforced peace had begun, and at the heart of it all stood the memory of New Terra, 3 million souls whose deaths had awakened a sleeping giant. Their legacy was a galaxy that understood one simple truth. Humanity would protect the innocent with every weapon at its disposal. Attack the defenseless and face 500,000 warships bringing justice. Never again would mean never again. The fleet stood ready. The galaxy took note, and peace became more than